Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the first Children and Family Scrutiny Board meeting of this municipal year. My name is Councillor Alan Lamb. I represent the Wetherby Ward and I'm the chair of this board. The meeting is being webcast on the council's website so that any interested members of the public that are unable to observe in person can still observe remotely. So as our custom, and particularly as it's our first meeting of the year, we'll do some introductions to start with. I'll just ask the board members to introduce themselves and then our guests can introduce themselves once we get to the relevant items. So as I say, I'm Councillor Alan Lamb, I'm the chair of the board, and I'll ask Angela to introduce herself first.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Angela Brogden, the Principal Scrutiny Advisor to the board.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Councillor Linda Richards, Wetherby Ward.
Good morning, Ryan Stevenson, Councillor for Harewood Ward.
Good morning, Councillor Sandy Lay, Otley and Eden Ward, and I'm subbing for Councillor Howley, who also has COVID.
Good morning, Councillor Anne Forsyth, Farnley and Wortley Ward.
Good morning, Laura Whitaker. I'm the cooperative representative for the voluntary sector Young Lives Leeds.
Jordan Bowden, Round A Ward.
Good morning, Councillor Emmy Bromley, Horsforth Ward.
Councillor John Tudor from Killingbeck and Seacroft Ward, subbing for Councillor Martin.
Morning all, Hannah Bethel from Kirkstall Ward.
Good morning, Councillor Zara Hussain, Round A Ward.
Good morning, everybody. Councillor Denise Reagan from Bermondsey and Richmond Hill Ward.
Good morning, Councillor Jules Hesselwood from Bromley and Stanley Ward.
Tony Britton representing Roman Catholic Diocese of Leeds.
Morning, Celia Foot, School Staff Representative.
Morning, Helen Bellamy, School Staff Representative.
Good morning, everyone. Councillor Karen Renshaw from Marcy Robin Hood Ward.
Easy for you to say, Councillor Renshaw. Well, good morning, everybody. You're all very welcome. It's a well-known fact that this is the best scrutiny board in the city, if not the whole country. And I'm sure you'll spread that message as you come to appreciate it. And also, we have a particularly special announcement this morning that Councillor Lay, who's kindly subbing for us, is celebrating his birthday today. So we wish him many happy returns. And what better way to spend your birthday than with us on this magnificent scrutiny board. So on to the agenda. If I can ask Angela, please, to run through the first 5 items of business.
Thank you, Chair. In relation to agenda item 1, there are no appeals against the refusal of inspection of documents. In relation to item 2, there are no items excluded from the public domain. Under item 3, there are no late items of business. And under item 4, can I please ask members to make any declarations of interest at this point? And I shall take silence as none, thank you. And in relation to item 5, we have apologies from Councillor Martin, with Councillor Tudor attending as substitute member, Councillor Howley, with Councillor Lay attending as substitute member, Councillor Senior, and from co-opted member Andrew Graham. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Angela. And we should also probably report that we've got apologies from Councillor Pryor, who's got other engagements, and also, unfortunately, Councillor Venner has got COVID. So, we're very ably covered with the deputy executive members, and they'll introduce themselves shortly once we get to those items. So thank you for joining us this morning. So item 6 is the minutes of the 11th of May. So for those that were present, we've done quite a few changes since then. Can we agree that they're an accurate record? Yep, thank you. And has anyone got any matters arising from that set of minutes? It's page 7 to 12 on the agenda pack. Again, I'll take silence that there's nothing to raise. So we can get into the meat of the agenda now. So item 7 is a standard item for the first meeting of the year, which just covers our co-opted members. So I'll ask Angela to take us through this, please.
Thank you, Chair. So the Scrutiny Board procedure rules within the Council's Constitution outlines the options that are available to Scrutiny Boards in relation to appointing co-opted members. This report provides the guidance to the Scrutiny Board when seeking to appoint co-opted members. In addition to the options that are available to all the Scrutiny Boards, there are legislative requirements regarding the appointment of specific education representatives onto the Children and Family Scrutiny Board. And so this report does set out how this statutory requirement has been met. And in doing so, the board welcomes back its voting education representatives, which includes Andrew Graham as the nominated Church of England Diocese representative, Tony Britton as the nominated Roman Catholic Diocese representative, Jackie Ward as the elected Parent Governor Representative for Secondary, and Kate Blacker as the elected Parent Governor Representative for Primary. In relation to non-voting co-optees, the appointment of non-voting school staff representation has been a long-standing approach that's been adopted by this particular board. And this year, both Celia Foote and Helen Bellamy have been nominated again by the School Staff Joint Consultative Committee to continue their role on the Scrutiny Board. And the Scrutiny Board's also previously invited co-opted member representation from the third sector through Young Lives Leeds, and this year Laura Whitaker has been nominated again to represent Young Lives Leeds on the Scrutiny Board. So I'll pass back to you now, Chair.
Thank you. Are there any questions or comments before we go to the recommendations? Nope. So we've got three recommendations. So first of all is to approve the appointment of non-voting co-opted members to the board. So everybody happy to do that? Yep, so that's done. B, note the nominations of the Roman Catholic Diocese and the Church of England Diocese to the board in accordance with statutory requirements. So that's just a note. So take it everyone's happy to note that. And then finally, C, just to note the appointed Parent Governor representatives to the board in accordance with the statutory requirements. So everybody happy with that? Okay, nice and easy. On we go. So item 8 is the Scrutiny Board Terms of Reference. And again, Angela, the star of the show this morning.
Thank you, Chair. Just very quickly, this report sets out the board's terms of reference for members' information, and you will see on Appendix 3 in particular that this gives an overview of how each of the Council's 5 individual scrutiny boards this year have been aligned to officer delegated functions and executive portfolio. So, Chair, this is purely to note for today.
Okay, so I'm sure everyone's had a chance to read them. Any questions or comments, or are we happy just to note them? Yep. Okay, thank you very much for that. Okay, so item 9, now we're moving on to sources of work for the Scrutiny Board for the year. So at this point, if I can ask our guests to introduce themselves, perhaps if we start with Sal and work our way along from there.
Morning, everybody. Salim Tariq, I'm Director of Children and Families.
Good morning. I'm Councillor David Jenkins, and I'm deputising for Councillor Venner as in her portfolio.
Good morning. I'm Councillor Jane Dowson, and I'm representing Councillor Harland, who couldn't be here today. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Shaheen Myers, Deputy Director, Learning.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Val Waite. I'm Head of Learning Inclusion.
Good morning, Tim Pouncey, Chief Officer for Resources and Strategy within the Directorate.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Dave Clark, Head of Service for Learning Improvement.
Okay, thank you all very much. And we send our best wishes to Councillor Venner, who I know is watching and trying to battle through her brain fog and follow on as you would expect. So hopefully she's feeling better soon. But thank you to Councillor Jenkins for filling in at the last minute for us. You're very welcome. So you obviously have the report in the pack, which runs from page 35 to 82. It gives information and guidance on potential sources of work and areas of priority for the board. There are always a ton of things that we would like to look at, but we only have so many meetings, so much time, so much officer resource that we can call on. So it's important that we prioritise. Councillor Pryor, who apologised that he couldn't be, he's sent a few things through which I'll run through if they're not covered by others. But at this point, if I can ask Sal perhaps to start first, and then Councillor Jenkins and Councillor Dowson, and anybody else that wants to chip in. And it's just really considering what areas we might look at. Then I'll ask for comments and thoughts of the board as well. Ultimately, we're going to go through the performance reports. There might be some things that come out of that will then feed into those discussions as well. So nothing is set in stone, but it's useful to get an idea of where people think we're at and what we should be looking at in the year ahead. So Sal, I'll hand over to you to start with.
Thanks, Councillor Lamb. I think this is the year that we are going to be looking at the refresh of the Children and Young People's Plan, because the previous plan runs up until 2023, and we've done some initial thinking about how we might consult on that, including with children, young people, families, and all our partners across the city. My sense is that what we're thinking about in relation to the Children and Young People's Plan is that it has one of the things that's been successful about it is its longevity, I think, because we've had a strategy around child-friendly Leeds for 10 years now, and we've seen significant improvements in services for children over that period of time as well. So I think the general direction of travel for the Children and Young People's Plan will probably remain similar, but we do want to refresh it, and particularly I think in light of the last few years that we've had and impacts of COVID. And I would have thought that Scrutiny would want to have an early opportunity perhaps to input into that, to help set the direction of travel, and to you know, for us to seek your views about how we might take that forward. I know we haven't, there's a deadline for reports to be submitted for the next scrutiny, which is the end of June, so there's not lots of time, but I did wonder whether as a substantive item we could bring the Children and Young People's Plan to July's meeting, and that is quite early on in the process of consultation, so you'd be getting a look at it early, and obviously once we're further into the year we could we can bring back what we're finding through the consultation. So that was one area. The other area I thought about was we've had the care review published quite recently that was led nationally by Josh McAllister, and it's got some broad and deep ramifications, I guess, longer term. So we might not want to go through the whole of that detail, but actually there is a substantive element of it which focuses on family help, and you know, I think some of the suggestions that are coming out of it are based on some of the things that we've done here in Leeds. We've had a recent review of our early help part of the service, so that would be an area that potentially we could look at in terms of how we might be moving forward with implementing some of the proposals that might stem from that review. And then we wondered about just from a health and well-being point of view for children and young people, and again particularly post-pandemic, whether children's mental health needed to remain firmly on the agenda, both in terms of how children are doing and coping in terms of their mental health, but also in terms of the services that we've got within the city, and what that picture looks like at the moment. I know that in the last year we did bring updates around the Future in Mind strategy, so that we could do that, but there's also the My Health, My School survey outcomes that we could take a look at within that work. Other areas that we've thought about are whether or not the board would want to look at Ofsted ratings of schools in the city. Just in you know, we obviously collate the data and the outcomes for all of that, and there's a possibility of bringing some of that, just identifying direction of travel and any themes that might come through that, but also if we wanted to, we could invite some of the schools in where there is recognised good practice that might be helpful to share more broadly across the sector. That I think there will be some proposals coming forward around elective home education. We've seen through the pandemic the numbers significantly increase. We described that as a spike, but it's not. The spike doesn't seem to have come back down at the moment, so the numbers remain relatively high. So would be, I think there's probably something about bringing the data around EHE here, and if there are new proposals, that would be useful for us to get a steer from Scrutiny here. I know already on the forward plan we've got an update around the 3A strategy and SEND strategies, and also I think we've got something on teacher recruitment. So those are kind of some of the areas that I think that I could point to in terms of big ticket items, really, in terms of what Scrutiny might want to look at.
Okay, thank you, Sal. Councillor Jenkins.
Yes, I very much agree with what Sal has said. I attended yesterday the launch of the Children, Young People's and Families Strategy for the Leeds Community Healthcare, which only came out yesterday. So it might be something that, because that's a strategy for 2022 to 2025, so it may be that we could collide those issues and some of the concepts that are being discussed with the refresh of the Children and Young People's Plan. The other area probably is about the SEND review, which is, I think, been extended to the 22nd of July. And it'd be interesting to see what the responses of organisations within the city to that review. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Dowson.
Right, thank you. And you'll have to forgive me. This is my first meeting as Councillor Harland's deputy. Councillor Harland's portfolio in relation to this scrutiny board is around youth services, something I know from being on that side of the table you're all quite passionate about, because it can make good quality youth work, as you know, can make a huge difference to the lives of children and young people. And you are actually reviewing it at the moment. I know the new youth work model has come as an update to you. You will have the paperwork for that, and I think it's coming back, is it March, for you to go through again. It is a theme going through it, and linking with what Councillor Jenkins has just said is around mental health and the follow on from COVID, and how that youth work can actually help and have it as a core part and at the heart of what it's actually offering. So I won't go to any further. You've got the report written down, but I think youth services is something you always have had your finger on the button of youth work, and I trust you will be doing that over the next year as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Dowson. Shaheen, anything from yourself?
It's just to echo what Sal said. If we sort of look at the best city ambition, and one of the pillars on the best city ambition is health and wellbeing. And when we consider post-pandemic recovery and children mental health and wellbeing, I think that will be a key line of focus for us to look at how schools have all used the My Health, My School survey, their response to My School, My Health survey, and also their own responses, because schools have got a duty of care to ensure that pupil voice and child voice is part and parcel of not only their curriculum, but their pastoral care and support. And how do schools govern the results of the survey, but also how do they implement that within their curriculum and their extra offer that they put in place as a whole, and then above and beyond that, that post-pandemic sort of recovery. So I think that would really help, because in the Children and Young People's Plan, as Sal has outlined, in terms of the refresh, we would be keen to still keep that social and emotional mental health and wellbeing as part of that. It's a strive, it feeds across all of our strategy and all of our work. And it's something that we know our children have faced considerably in terms of challenge over these past 3 years, significantly. So we would be keen to keep that as part of it. So probably just echoing in terms of what Sal said, in terms of Ofsted coming to us with some trends and patterns, what is our city representing in terms of its grading for Ofsted, and then how that grading in terms of its strong outcomes, because we do have its very strong outcomes, how does that tie in within the white paper agenda and ambition for all schools to be academised by 2030? We'll actually have quite strong maintained schools in terms of its gradings, and inviting head teachers along will give the real reflection and story about their work towards securing overall effectiveness, their own response to Ofsted, and Ofsted not being the only measure of success, but how actually they're demonstrating and evidencing their post-pandemic recovery, but also those really strong outcomes that they all strive for. And I think that would be really welcomed, because it would give us a sense of the playing field, inviting schools and also academies to give that sort of thorough look into it. And also it could be a really great opportunity to discuss some of the services that we're offering in terms of SEND and school improvement, and it will then give us a bit of a stop check on where we go in terms of the green paper and also the white paper ambition as well.
Okay, thank you, Shaheen. Val, anything?
I think it's all been covered, those areas really. So I think one of the main things will be looking at the consultation paper, the green paper, and some of the implications of that, and aligning that with our SEND strategy for the city. So you look at actually identifying the factors that we have already identified as a city that we need to work with, and then looking at the overall, the national picture and the direction of travel, and seeing the synergy between the two and identifying those key points. So that's already been mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you. And Tim or Dave, anything you wanted to add?
Thanks, Councillor Lamb. I guess this is the advantage of this side of the table when we've already been through a few things. The one thing that I would add, and it probably goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway, is that Scrutiny Board have always been instrumental in helping shape our budget proposals. There's a lot of work going on at the moment in terms of the medium-term financial strategy. And we'll be heading to exec board in September, I think it is, with a refresh of that. So after the summer and into the autumn, we'll need to be discussing with you proposals around our contribution to plug in the gap that will be identified in terms of some of the pressures in the medium-term financial strategy, inflation and demand and demography, to name but two, which are going to present us with some real challenges. And I think we've got to think long and hard about the extent to which our proposals are similar to those that we came up with this year, which were around sort of invest to save proposals. You may recall that we've done something on fostering and residential homes for children looked after. And I think we need to sort of replicate that approach. So it will be very useful to have those conversations with the board.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. I think it goes without saying for the budget especially, but for all things, that the sooner we can be involved and have our input, I think the bigger impact we can have. And then finally, Dave.
Thanks, Councillor Lamb. I think most of the things have been covered there between my colleagues there, but I think possibly anything that may come up this morning in discussion, and I think Councillor Pryor's sort of mentioned it as well, is looking at this year's examination results. There's significant amounts of caveats around how we use that to compare to previous results and things. But that's maybe something that Scrutiny later on in the year, once we've got the valid results after Christmas, may want to look at. We could sort of like explain some of those caveats that we've done over the last year or so too, and how we wouldn't be able to give sort of definitive sort of how COVID's impacted on our specific young people in Leeds, but we would be able to give some sort of rough ideas and for Scrutiny to explore a bit.
Okay, thank you, Dave. Yeah, and the other bits that Councillor Pryor that haven't been picked up were around SEND funding and provision, particularly in view of increasing demand, and looking at the schools bill and the impact on Leeds and Leeds children. They're the other things you asked me to pick up. So, okay, well, that's a really helpful start. And then I'll open up to members if there's any questions, comments or ideas of things that we might want to consider. The practice, if you pop your hand up, I'll take the speakers in the order that I see them. We do have the performance report to come as well, and it may be that through that discussion there are things that come out as well that we want to look at. So, but it's just useful to get people's thoughts and ideas at this stage. So I've got Celia first, please, and then I'll just take everyone.
Thank you, Chair. Really asking advice. I don't know if it was the last meeting we had or the one before that. I did suggest that we might have a briefing on the white paper, and I'm just wondering whether the white paper and the green paper, if it'd be useful early on to get a briefing on it, because it could inform the work that is done by the board later on. I was really wondering whether people on that side thought it'd be worthwhile.
I think it's definitely worthwhile having a briefing on it. So I think we are waiting for quite a lot of detail to come through in terms of the white paper and its ramifications. So we can hold a workshop, which I think will be probably a really good idea in terms of really getting into some of that detail, and then holding something a bit more informal where we can discuss it in detail along with the green paper as well. And I don't know if that's something that people will be interested in, but the workshop would give us then a key focus on certain areas and allow us to go into a bit more depth than I think than it would do as an entire board, because there's still levels of detail that haven't come through yet that we're waiting for. In terms of the green paper, the response, the consultation response, as you heard earlier, the partners' responses and other organisation responses, that will be really sort of interesting to go into, delve in a bit more detail and what that would look like in terms of proposals. But the white paper has now become the schools bill, and the schools bill has been diluted as such in terms of its actual level and degree of information. But there are some areas that we need to have some real consideration and debate and discussion around, really, in terms of our position and how that stands. So I would suggest a workshop which goes into a bit more detail.
Thank you for that. That's helpful. Councillor Reagan, please.
Yeah, I was glad to hear that SEND was mentioned in most people's reports back, but I think we need to delve a little bit more into children and young people with complex needs and with really severe disabilities, how they can extend their learning and be a product that helps their well-being and to the city as well. And I don't think we've got there at the minute. I think we're doing a lot of good stuff, but I think it's still not integrated to the sense that we need to make it more integrated, so that it seems as if it's an add-on rather than being inclusive into the thing. So I don't want to see that happening.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Bithell, please.
Thanks, Chair. As always, I have a number. Just to pick up on a couple of things that have been said at the beginning. I think it's absolutely right. And I couldn't agree more with us looking at the Children and Young People's Plan. That feels really, really important. It was also talked about keeping the mental health of young people on the agenda. And I'd quite like us to add to that the impact of the effects of parents' mental health on young people and what provision in schools and in youth provision we have to deal with the impacts of that. I would really like us to be doing some work on young offenders. I know we do the young offenders review during the year, but actually making a bit more of that. It isn't something that I think we've delved as a board particularly deep into in my time as a councillor. I'd quite like us to look at Ukrainian children's integration and support that's being offered, as we now have refugee children arriving. The main thing I'd like us to look at is extracurricular opportunities for young people, making sure that our young people growing up ready for society, ready to be citizens of Leeds, means that we need to have equal opportunities across the city for our young people to engage in outside of school as well as inside of school. And again, I don't think it's something we've necessarily looked at in detail while I've been elected. Obviously, I'm aware we can't do all of this, but we're at the mind mapping stage. I'd like us to look at attendance post-COVID, and also post-COVID, the achievement, specifically the impact of the tutoring money that was given to schools. Like ad hoc information or anecdotal information that's come to me is that actually it was so red taped by the government that actually it wasn't as useful as it could have been. And I'd like to see what the impact actually was on our young people, and whether there's anything further that needs to be done in order to make sure that we're catching up that lost time. I will always ask for us to look harder at minoritized students' experiences in education in Leeds. It's a passion of mine as LGBT champion. And I think it would be interesting, sorry, Tim, to look at the budgets and spending in schools. We know that schools are strapped for cash, and actually I've had to have extra little meetings as a councillor to try and understand the minutiae of the funding, because it's incredibly complex, certainly to me. And I think without looking at it in quite a lot of detail as a scrutiny board, we're missing some of the key details in how we can improve education and outcomes for our young people. Thanks.
Thank you for that. Yep, there's going to be a lot of meetings this year. Councillor Renshaw is next, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to ask about the extended work of the youth service and what they are delivering throughout the city. Now, recruitment is being carried out, as there's been a stretch within the youth service for quite a lengthy period. And right from when I first started on the scrutiny board, they were going to train some new senior youth officers, and that still has not been carried out. And yet there's an increase in mental health issues that the youth service do address. And when I've looked at the role of the life coaches and what they would be doing, it would be more or less duplicating the work that is already delivered by, the team that cover my ward do fantastic work within the youth service. And I'm just wondering how that role is going to, how those recruitments are going to take place eventually in order to be able to deliver to the more demanding need of that service for young people's provision, to address the mental health issues and the safeguarding issues that have all come about, especially since COVID. So I just wondered if someone on there could tell me how that's going to be achieved. I think that's something that we need to put at the top of the agenda.
Okay, thanks for that, Councillor Renshaw. Councillor Stevenson, please.
Thank you, Chair. A few points on the schools bill, the various white and green papers. I think we need to put the issue into two separate camps. I think the briefing that we need fairly swiftly would be useful, but in order to not duplicate, I think there's a very good objective one already that's been prepared by the House of Commons Library on it. That would help us, mean that staff don't have to go around and do that. And in the workshop, then that's the subjective bit of it, is how it's going to affect us in Leeds. And I think it's really important that when we have that, we include multi-academy trust colleagues across the city in that, because it's not just local authority that might be affected by changes. There'll be huge changes for MATs as well. And it'll be interesting to know of the MATs that already operate in Leeds, what their capacity would be to expand if schools have to academise. Is that going to be in existing MATs, or will there be new MATs? And what's the picture, the landscape look like in Leeds? Linked to that as well, it'd be useful to see if we can get a picture across the schools in the city, how the schools are making changes to the minimum hours of operation they have to be now open per week, and what that looks like across the city in different areas of the city. On our Ukrainian students, 100% agree, but can we not forget our Afghan students as well? There are many in the city, and actually the way that Ukrainian families are being supported in schools, a lot of the lessons learned from that actually came about through the Afghan resettlement scheme. And I'll take the opportunity now to say it's in the work programme, but we've talked before about recruitment and retention, and I think we need to do a huge amount of work in the work programme on recruitment and retention of not just teaching staff, but school staff, and now increasingly social workers as well. And I think we need to have a spend, and actually I would argue prioritise a lot of our time on recruitment and retention of teaching staff and social workers.
Thank you. Councillor Heselwood, please.
Yeah, it was just, I mean, obviously a lot's been said, so I won't go over that. There are a few things I agreed with, so I'll leave that. But I just want to say on the exams, I think it's really, and the achievement, I think it's really important that we have a look at the exam data and we look at the impact the last 2 years have had on children in the city. I'm going through that at the moment. My son is doing his GCSEs. He's sitting English as we speak right now. So I'm living this day in, day out with a child who's had 2 years of continued interrupted education, and the things he's told me, you know, that lived experience that he's told me about of going through that and then having to sit his GCSEs at the end of that as we're speaking now, and obviously we've had 2 years as well of teacher assessed grades, and these are the first young people to actually sit exams again since 2019. So I think there's a lot of things to look at within that data when we get it through, and to look at how that's impacted. So I think that's a big focus that we need to look at on how that's impacted children's achievements, and as Councillor Biffle says, that extra money that was given for that achievement as well, how all that has worked and where we are with that, definitely.
Thank you for that. Councillor Bowden, please.
Hi, yeah, I'd be interested to know, I guess with the summer holidays coming up quite soon, what sort of allocation or in regards to, or provisions in regards to tackling hunger. And I know like a big success for Leeds has been the healthy holiday funding. So I'd be interested to know, is there a surplus and is there been an uptake in schools? Because with the rise in costs at the moment, I think more than likely this summer holiday might be the biggest strain for a lot of families have faced since the healthy holiday funding has been provided. And, you know, looking at the agenda in regards to antisocial behaviour, that's a provision that can help with that, with, I guess, SEN children and social and children with social, emotional, mental health needs. Typically, when you're looking at those children who can be selected to come into school to get that provision, those children tend to be recipients of that as well. So, yeah, I'd just be interested to know what is the surplus like, what's the funding like at the moment, and I would be interested to know if any schools have had that willpower to actually go and apply for the funding, because you can see on the website those wards that do have schools that have got it, and in my own ward we have one school, and so that's something that I really want to push myself as a ward councillor, but I'd be interested to know what as a council are we doing to sort of, I guess, we put the funding there, but are we pushing the heads and the senior leadership teams to actually take that money and use it?
Okay, thank you for that. Councillor Richards, please.
Thank you, Chair. Right, so a lot of issues we know are equally important within the educational, you know, what we do with educationalists, and many of them have been raised already, and certainly Councillor Biffle went through the panoply of those, and it's not to say that any of them are more or less important. I think some of them it's the short term, long term, we all know that, some of them are continuum that go through. One of the ones that with which I'm involved at the moment is about the impact of the influx of Ukrainians into our educational system. And it's not just about the education, it's about the impact in a complex way. And it's whether, you know, putting up the, I've already hit SEND, I've already hit housing, I've already hit food, we've already hit lots of things in that way. So my question would be that on the more immediate short term, how are we as a city addressing those more complex needs of having to integrate and support those additional communities within our educational framework? And it's also supporting those who are supporting them. So we look at the schools, and here we are. I'm in a ward where we have no spare primary places. So what happens when we have children who come in and need education? And normally you would say, well, you need to go and travel to X. Well, that's not really as useful to those families where travel is an issue, full stop. So I would like to, you know, for us to look at that in its broader sense and to see how we as a city are addressing those issues. Thank you.
Thank you. Helen, please.
Most of my points have actually been covered, but Celia and I were talking in terms of recruitment and retention, particularly of teachers. It's looking at the routes to qualification in terms of recruitment, and which are there groups, or is there a route where teachers are exiting from their jobs more if they've trained through a certain route, or is it quite equal across? And already in the pre-meet I brought up a big issue that was pinpointed by Matt yesterday. They can't actually recruit support staff because the wages are too low, and they're looking at retainers because of term time only pay. And then the final thing that I wanted to bring up was linked to what Karen said with the youth service. I know it was mentioned that the profile of the youth service and the status is kind of being raised, and just questions about the staffing structure and whether there are any plans for there to be full-time staff as part of that department, or is it, I seem to remember that there were mainly 18-hour contracts. So I'd just be interested to know whether that's to continue as is, or are there any plans to change that? Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. Councillor Forsyth, please.
Right, thank you very much. I agree that with all of these areas that we need to look at, and we're certainly going to have a very busy year ahead. I just wanted to confirm that, so I think it was Dave that said about looking at this year's exam results, and wanted to confirm that that would be the SATs as well. And I think in a way that links to some of the other areas we're looking at, and it links to teacher recruitment and retention, and also looking at the sort of the work on the Ofsted ratings of schools. And I think that is quite an important piece of work early on, has already been pointed out.
Thank you. Councillor Bromley, please.
Thank you. I just wanted to discuss something that was mentioned at the beginning by Sal regarding homeschooling and the numbers that have actually increased since and during the pandemic. Homeschooling is something that I did with my own daughter for a year. That was about 3 years ago now, and she's now in high school. But during that experience, I managed to chat to a lot of families, and I think in terms of mental well-being and their cautiousness regarding schools being able to allow well-being appropriately to their children and a teacher-pupil ratio, discussing also retention and obviously recruitment being really important and linking into that. I don't think until those things are focused and able to be addressed, we'll be able to shift back and allow them to be feeling supported and able to return.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so the one thing I've got on my list that hasn't come up elsewhere is around looking at education, health and care plans. which I know there's work being done on that. But I think it's again something we might consider having a look at through scrutiny over the year. So, Sal, is there anything that's come up there that quite a lengthy list of things that is either a surprise to you, or you would say that wasn't on your list already, or things that you think we should or shouldn't look at?
No, I mean, I think generally, we could look at any of those areas. I'd be happy to progress with those. I think, as I was listening, I think part of I was thinking a bit about what are the critical challenges for us in the coming year, and certainly workforce is going to be a major challenge. It's a major challenge across all industries, really, isn't it? But I think that issue around, particularly for us in terms of children's services, around teachers and social workers is an issue. I think you could roll that up with looking at demand pressures post COVID, because we have seen significant increases in referrals to children's services over the last few months. I think we're 30% up in terms of referrals coming through the front door, and the workload is up around 15% across children's services. So we've got higher numbers of children subject to child protection plan, higher numbers of children in care as well. So I think that might merit a look at. And then youth work's always popular with the board to have a look at, and I guess we'd be in a position to be able to bring a update since the review that we brought here previously, to say where have we got to in terms of the implementation of the recommendations that we had back then.
Okay, thank you, Sal. And the other thing that hasn't come, I'm certain, had Councillor Venner have been sat at the table, she'd have raised poverty as one of the big challenges facing the city. So I get that's something. So there's an awful lot there, and we won't be able to do justice to everything that we've flagged up. So I think what we need to go away, and myself and Angela, and work with Sal to package those things up into inquiries that make sense, look at themes that are coming through, and try and bring back to the board a considered proposal of work that we can do justice to. There's always a balance of going into a great deal of depth and detail in a small number of things and covering as many areas as we can, and we've just got to get that balance right, because there's an awful lot of places we could have a big impact, but we need to make sure we make the most of it. Councillor Jenkins.
Yes, just to thank you, Councillor Lamb, just to emphasise that the underlying problem over the next year is going to be the cost of living and the fuel crisis. And I think that needs to be addressed. And I think the council is going to look at setting up a breakthrough group that looks at all those aspects together. And it may be that this scrutiny board could look at that as an issue, because it's going to affect badly the most vulnerable people in the city. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So there's a lot to think about there. So yeah, Angela and I will go away and try and make some sense of all of it, and come back with something for next time. So thank you all for your contributions on that. So we're moving on to item 10 now, which is the performance update. So I think Chris will be coming to join us, so I'll just let him get settled. And I think have we got Ruth Terry? Obscured by a pillar, so I'll let you both get settled in. So the report that you've got, which is pages 83 to 96 on the agenda pack, it's just providing a summary of performance information relating to outcomes for children and young people in Leeds. So perhaps if I can ask Chris and Ruth to introduce themselves, and I think it will be Chris taking us through the report.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Chris Hudson. I am a Performance Programme Manager working in Children and Families Directorate.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Ruth Terry. I'm the Chief Officer for Children's Social Work in Leeds.
Just wanted to run through a few key points from the report before opening up for any questions from the board. What we've tried to do in this report is add some more content into the main body of the report following some feedback when we last came to scrutiny with the performance report. So you will find from points 13 to 17 in the main report, there's a summary of what's contained in the appendices. I'm going to pick out a couple of points from those areas. Probably just a quick note to say that the report does briefly mention attainment data coming later in the year and the refresh of the Children and Young People's Plan, but given that they've already been mentioned earlier, I'm not going to touch upon those now. I'd like to start at point 15 of the report, which gives a summary of our 3 obsessions. Starting with the children looked after numbers. So at the end of March this year, there were 1,365 children who were looked after, which is an increase of 87 from the previous March. We'll have some national and regional data to compare Leeds' change to in the autumn. I think it's likely that we'll see a rise in our comparators. As Sal said, we're seeing a rise in some of our demand pressures and increases, and having talked to performance colleagues around the country, I know there's similar rises in demand being seen across the country. In terms of school attendance, we've been able to provide you with 2 sets of data. One covers the previous academic year, so that's 2020-21, and that shows that primary school attendance is in line with national figures and secondary attendance is just below national. For the current academic year, we have some data up to the end of April. Now that shows that both primary and secondary attendance in Leeds are slightly above national. And it's important to note that the 2 sources of attendance data here are different, so you can't compare them directly because of the way the figures are calculated, but you can compare Leeds' relative position within each of those data sets. We've included information about neat and not known data. So the focus in the appendix is very much on the annual performance indicator and the September guarantee, which are 2 big set pieces in the year. But you'll also note that in Appendix 1, we have the March 2022 figures, which show from the previous March a rise in the neat numbers, but a drop in the not known figures. And that's likely because as we establish more statuses of young people, some of those who were in the not known field do become neat, some become EAT obviously, but some become neat. Point 17, we've included an update on Initial Child Protection Conference timeliness, and this has been a topic that's been periodically discussed at the board over recent years, and the appendix covers a reduction that we saw in the timeliness of some of those conferences in November and December of last year, gives a bit of context as to why that happened, what interim arrangements were in place, and the subsequent recovery of timeliness. There's some figures, I think, up to the end of March that show the timeliness has increased. It's important to note here that children were appropriately safeguarded during the dip, and interim safety plans were put in place. The issue was also raised during the recent Ofsted inspection, and there's a brief reference to that in the letter that Ofsted provided. But as I said, that's been something that the board has looked at previously, so we felt it was important to raise that. And I think that's probably the main areas that I wanted to mention before opening for any questions or points of clarity members may have. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I just check if Sal or Councillor Jenkins or Councillor Dowson wanted to add anything to the introduction? No, quite happy. Okay, so we'll open up to questions, comments. Councillor Richards.
Thank you very much for that. I'll go straight through to where you talked about attendance, particularly in the primary schools where we've got the figure of 96.4%. I'm interested, that's a Leeds global figure. So is there a differential between the best and the worst? So in other words, that's going to be obviously an overall figure. So that's the first question, what's the difference between the best figures and the worst figures? And does that in turn correlate to any socio-economic factors? In other words, where is it? What does that impact on those figures? And the third one is has that changed, those difference of figures from previous years? Thank you.
Thank you. There will be a difference. Yes, I don't have those figures to hand, but we can find those. There may well be links to socioeconomic factors, and we would have to look at the essentially the gap between the best and the worst to establish if that has changed. But that information is available, so we will go away and try and find that and provide that at a later date.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Renshaw, please.
Thank you, Chair. It's just a brief comment, and it's been asked on a number of occasions on this scrutiny board, and it's just regarding the figures that are in percentages. It would be nice to have a figure of what that percentage is, because there might be 4% of however many. So if you could possibly provide those figures as well as the percentages, I think that would be helpful to many of us around this table. Thank you.
Yep, thank you. Councillor, we've been making that point for about 15 years, as far as I can remember. Yeah. Very good. Okay. Any more questions? Any more questions or comments? Councillor Bithell, please.
Hi there. Thank you. Just a couple of comments, actually, mainly. Looking at the figures for reoffending, it feels like that also plays into my request for more information on young offenders and for scrutinising, because actually that's 36% compared to our statistical neighbours being 29 is reasonably high. So actually that might even direct. So what is it that is being done to avoid reoffending might actually direct the scrutinisation of it. Looking at the children in need plans, there seems to be quite significant jumps. And I just wondered if, so that I can more accurately gauge the size of the jumps, is there a lot of migration in it? So when there's a 200 difference, is that 200 new plans, or is actually we've moved 500 young people off plans but 700 on? Does that make sense? And then it also talks about the neat not known, and I just wondered whether there's any anecdotal evidence around how and if there have been any cuts to staff, and whether this is affecting our ability to locate young people, because we know the financial situation we're in currently. Thank you.
I can pick up a couple of those. Certainly the reoffending one. Yeah, I think, as you say, it is higher. One of the things we're seeing is a decreasing cohort of offenders, but the cohort of reoffenders is remaining a bit high. So there is a bit of percentage statistical element going on there. But yes, certainly it has remained higher than with statistical neighbours. In terms of child in need plans, there will be some instances where there are children and young people returning onto plans. There will be some new, totally new to that. And it's the same with children looked after in child protection plans. Sometimes you have a return of some. I wouldn't know what the exact split is off the top of my head, but given that we are seeing an increase in referrals and through that, there may be an increase in new to plans for the first time coming on, but we would have to look to establish that.
So just come in, Councillor.
Yeah.
So just, I think the children in need one is probably a reflection of increased demand. Not all circumstances that we're working with work in a linear way. But some do work in a linear fashion, so people first come to our attention through early help and then into child in need, and where those issues aren't resolved, you can see them moving on to child protection plans and potentially children being looked after. And I think that the 30% increase that I alluded to earlier will be reflected in that children in need figure. Ordinarily, we normally work with around 5,100 children at any given time, and that number's been up at around 5,800, 5,900. So there will be that increase will be reflected across those three categories. So we've talked a bit about increases in numbers of children looked after, and certainly those subject to a child protection plan has gone up in this last period, and children in need. And then on the staffing issue around employment, education and training, I think historically there were different levels of staffing around that. I think we've been impacted a bit through the pandemic because of, in addition to that, because of some of the prioritisation that we've had to do in terms of moving some of our staff around, and particularly to cover safeguarding challenges that we've had in the pandemic. We've also had a look at the processes around those not in employment, education, training, and done a business process mapping exercise. We have identified some additional capacity that's needed, and we're on with that recruitment at this moment in time.
Thank you. Councillor Renshaw, did you want to come back in on that?
I was just going to ask about the not knowns, and I'm quite surprised that there's almost as many as last year of the not knowns. I just wondered what work was being undertaken to address the number of not known children and young people throughout the city. Thank you, Chair.
And I think it's something that we're working on all of the time. We do have some specific staff, particularly within the youth work service, that chase up and try and identify those young people whose circumstances are not known. So we are working on it all of the time. There's a dedicated team that does it. I think there's something about when we did the business process mapping, there was something about improvements that we needed to make to how we collate the data, which we've done. There is something about coordinating activity because it sits in lots of different places, responsibility for this. So that's a new post that we have established and are recruiting to. And we've also identified a number of areas where the data coming into us is delayed or not accurate, and Shaheen's working on having conversations individually with those organisations in order that we can improve that as well.
Thank you. Councillor Richards, please.
Thank you, Chair. Follows on really from the last question about the not knowns. It's about the September guarantee. It would appear that the position in Leeds relative to the national one is not a positive one. Now, as someone who actually works with young people in that capacity and knows the work that goes on in schools, I'm kind of surprised to see that, if I'm very honest. I'm wondering if we are looking for the causes of that. In other words, why is it that it would appear that young people are deliberately taking themselves out of the systems which exist to support them and which exist to make that progress in that way? Thank you.
I mean, I think this is an issue that we have spent some time looking at over the last year, because the figures were not so great last time. So I identified some of the improvements that we are making, including putting some more dedicated capacity into this area. I do think as a big city we are impacted by things like the pandemic in a more significant way than some of our comparators, but that doesn't take away from the point that you've identified, and we need to do better on it, and we are making those changes in order that we can improve in the coming year.
Councillor Dowson.
Sorry, I'm just butting in a little bit because this is something when I was on Scrutiny and previously when I was actually a deputy exec board member and exec board member, that we spoke about a lot, and we did have a call to action which actually reduced our numbers considerably, because in theory there's no such thing as a not known child. They're just not known to us. And we're not talking often about people who would identify as children. We're talking about people who would identify as young adults who have their own mind and they know what they want to do. And often they do that. They go to work and they do all the kind of things that you would expect and you would have wanted to do as a young independent adult. But we do need to know these figures, and it's how to get these figures. So I do totally sympathise with schools and people who gather those statistics. Those numbers are out there somewhere, and we just have to find them. So how we do that is a challenge, Sal, and I think it's one hopefully the whole city can embrace, because everybody should take this on as part of their core of looking after children and young people in Leeds.
If I can just come back 1 minute. I would agree that we should work to it together, and there are examples of good practice. I'm sure you're aware, as I am, and I would just hope that as a city we can learn from those examples of good practice, because they are out there and they do provide that information. And it may be that better awareness of those examples would be a better way forward in that way. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Lay, please.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I just wanted to ask about the somewhere in the report, and I only got it late yesterday, which is why I'm rather quiet, because I haven't had a chance to read most of it. It talks about £2 million additional funding that's been made available. Now, one of the things that we've talked about over the previous year, and I suspect we will talk about again and have done in the past, is children in need, SENS, ECHPs or EHCPs, whichever way around it is. And Val in the past has talked about a huge increase and a diminishing workforce for her team to support. And I know myself that I have a number of parents and with children who are having difficulties navigating the SEND process. And we've talked about large caseloads for your staff, Val. I wondered if things were improving, whether part of that 2 million additional was being directed to yourselves, so that you can start to, and I can start to reassure some of those very vociferous expert parents, because I think that's what we forget. Children's parents are experts, very often experts in SEND, and they seem to be able to, when they write to me, they seem to be able to tie our teams up in knots around things that our teams should be able to know and do. And they seem much, anyhow, I'm digressing. Is there more funding and more staff for your team, Val? And secondly, we've talked about elective homeschooling this year as part of this board, and we've been I was surprised that there was no legal requirement for a child to attend school. Just what sits with me was that there is a legal requirement for the child to get an education, but it doesn't have to be in school. And so with so many, and the rise in homeschooling, there are going to be so many unknowns when it comes to NEETs at 16, 17, because those children haven't been in mainstream education, and and parents haven't been under any formal regulatory or legal requirement to tell the council what the hell they're doing with their kids. So I think there's lots of things that still can be done to engage with those kids. But from my own point of view, I just wanted to say that my 17-year-old, who is just going through his mocks at A level, we've had plenty of correspondence from the council. So I wouldn't be too hard on ourselves as a organisation, in that certainly from my point of view, I'm aware that we are engaging with parents, and we can't force parents to engage with us by the looks of things.
Quick thanks. Comment. I mean, I appreciate that, Councillor Lay, because it is an area that you're right. We do get a lot of correspondence about, and sometimes we are hearing about the bits that haven't quite worked as well. and not always the bits that do work well. So it can be quite a challenging place to be. In terms of the funding, we dedicated £500,000 of that 2 million to this area of work specifically, and we are also looking at further investor save proposals that we might be able to make in the coming financial year, because it is an area that definitely needs more attention and investment. Workloads are high in this part of the world. It is a significant pressure, but we have got plans in place at the moment where we're undertaking recruitment, but that is in the context of the general picture around recruitment and retention of staff. So it is a situation where we have identified additional funding. We are looking to do more. We're trying to recruit into the posts as quickly as possible, but it is at this moment in time a place that's under a significant amount of pressure. Val might want to come in just on a bit more.
Thank you. Really appreciate that, Councillor Lay. And I absolutely, support parents at this moment in time who do not feel, that the response, the communication is good enough. We are aware of that. We are working on that. We have suffered enormous capacity issues. We've had people, I think in a lot of industries at the moment, it's true to say people have reevaluated their lives. So we've had a lot of people that have left the team, Sensat team, have moved into other places. Recruitment is difficult as well within that area, but we are working hard on it. And as Sal has just said, we've got further investment, and we're out at the moment looking at those processes and structures, as well as building the capacity within the team. I think one of the key areas that we've looked at is actually about the administration support within the team, because when we have looked at the complaints that are coming in from families, the categorisation of those complaints, 3 main areas, and 2 of those areas are absolutely about the communication that we have with families. So when they're trying to ring through and they're not getting a response, and also the timeliness, of information going out. So we've done a whole piece of work that's with our business support teams and services to improve that element. So alongside the additional recruitment, the additional capacity, and then also improving that communication system, we are very hopeful that things will improve very shortly.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I think it's true to say that, and as someone who turns 55 today, as you all know, and had chosen to reevaluate my work life, I know, because I'm retiring in 2 weeks, well, part-time retiring, that we are, that the council will be in the same position as we are in my A&E. You all know I work in A&E. We're hemorrhaging staff because we're worn out, we're overwhelmed, we're overworked. We're hemorrhaging experienced, knowledgeable, skillful practitioners. And it's not enough just to recruit new people. It's the quality of the recruitment. So we can't get experienced, qualified, knowledgeable A&E nurses. So we're having to employ newly qualified nurses and nurses who have had 1 or 2 years on the ward. The reason I say that is because I suspect they're the problems you're going to have as well. And that it isn't just about bums on desks. They've got to have time to learn the job, be taught the job, to understand the job. And all of that will take time, unless you're telling me that you're going to suddenly get a dozen experienced SEND operators from other local authorities, because you're just nicking from somebody else. So there is a lot still to be done, but it is pleasing to hear that we are trying to deal with it. But you're fighting a losing battle, if the truth be known, because there's 115 industries and sectors suffering from a shortage of staff. And I don't know what the answer is, but just best wishes that you sort it out, really. All right.
I think that's quite, articulately put really in terms of describing some of the challenges that we are facing. And there's something about having, on a number of fronts, having to do something to try and arrest people leaving in the immediate sense, something about continuing to recruit more people at the same time, but also at the same time putting in those medium-term measures that are going to that we might not see immediate benefits from, but that will make it sustainable in the longer term. So the whole idea of particularly around those areas where you've got qualified staff, growing your own from unqualified staff and supporting them through their learning, and then establishing a longer term stay for them with the council. So we are working on all those fronts, but yeah, it's tough.
Okay, thank you for that. I think the recruitment and retention theme comes across a lot of sectors and industries at the minute. Okay, okay. I don't see any more hands up. So I didn't see it, Councillor Reagan. So I apologise for that. Well, I've seen everybody else's. So wave a bit more frantically, and I'll get.
I will. Yeah, I'm looking at the indicators on the cluster level. And I'm a bit confused in the sense of, your footnotes, it's about the children that attend a school that maybe is not in the cluster area. And I think it's this issue, isn't it, about, I can see on here that a lot of the inner city clusters are high up on the levels. And I think we need to, or you need to look at the funding that goes to the clusters and link more in with Councillor Harlan's portfolios around the families and the youth service side of things to try and make some extracurricular and more challenging programs to meet the needs of these areas, as in my ward in Bermondsey and Richmond Hill, as in my colleague here, Bromley, and so on and so forth. So I think we need a little bit more sifting about this cluster sort of model, don't we?
Obviously, the funding that we have for services in the clusters is based on some of that demographic information. In the same way, you'll be aware of how we've done that work around youth work. The same sort of formulas have been used in terms of clusters. It's a constant challenge in terms of the level of need that's out there. So we do look at that regularly.
I can understand that, Sal, but what I'm getting at is the young people that are attending and that are getting into trouble and not having the help and support from the family unit when school days are finished. They don't necessarily attend the school that the cluster is in the local vicinity. And I think we completely need to look at and rejig the amount of resources that are going into families and young people that live in areas of deprivation to make sure they have got the ample opportunities that other young people and children have.
Councillor Dowson.
Yeah, I think Councillor Reagan hit the nail on the head when she said the word opportunities. And it is providing our young people with as many opportunities as they can. And we talk about children and young people, but we're also really talking about families and extended families and communities that actually come together to help support young people. And I often think we talk about putting children and young people at the heart of what we do, but really it's a bit like a jigsaw puzzle. You put the edge pieces in first and hopefully things will fit together and eventually you'll end up with a whole. So it's linking the third sector, it's linking schools, it's linking youth services, it's linking all the offers that are out there, bearing in mind that we've got reduced funding in the city for all these things and so on. How do we actually achieve a young person that actually is grounded and can move forward when they leave school? And it's a huge challenge. It is a huge challenge. So I think looking at that jigsaw puzzle and where we can make the pieces, some may need to be bigger on one side of the jigsaw than another to actually make sure that we level, it's the key word, and level up across the city the offer that we're actually giving. And it's really difficult. I do empathise, because, you know, all young people are entitled to an offer. But in some areas, the disadvantage, the holiday hunger, you can't learn at school if you're going to go to school and you've no breakfast and your tummy's rumbling. It's just not going to happen. If you're going home and you're not sleeping on a bed, you're just sleeping on the floor because your parents haven't got the money to buy a mattress or pajamas or whatever. You know, the challenges are out there and they're huge. And I think sometimes living in our sort of little cosseted world, we don't actually recognise all the difficulties that poverty, and this is why the Marmot work that's going on is going to be key going forward.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else I've missed? Just in case, no. Okay. So the recommendations we have are to consider and comment on the performance information, which I think we've done. I think there's a number of themes that have come back that we discussed previously of areas of work that we might want to look at. And then B is to look at how we'd want to be involved in the refresh of the Children and Young People's Plan, which we've discussed, and potentially that could come to the July board meeting as a substantive item. So I think we've covered all those off. So if I can thank everybody for their contributions, and Chris and Ruth, so you're very welcome to stay for the rest of the session, but we won't be offended if there are other things you'd like to go and do. So, okay, so moving on now to item 11, which is the inquiry into exclusions, elective home education and off-rolling, and this is the statement of progress. So for Councillor Bithell. Go on then. Okay, we'll aim for 5 minutes, please. And just if everyone can make sure their microphones are turned off, we'll hopefully get the sign up on the screen. Okay, if everyone could take their seats again, please, and we'll get started. Okay, so welcome back, everybody. We're moving on to item 11, which is the statement of progress on our inquiry into exclusions, elective home education and off-rolling, which is now possibly the longest running inquiry we've ever had as a scrutiny board. So long-standing members will recall that we started this prior to the pandemic, which then somewhat got in the way, and tried to pick it up again last year, and a number of other things got in the way. So we decided that we'd bring a statement of where we'd got to this board, and then we can decide what our next steps are from there. And obviously, this is something that has come up still as a piece of work that we could potentially look at in discussions this morning. So I was going to ask Angela to introduce the report. Then if Sal or Shaheen and Val have got any additional comments they want to make, and then we can look at where we want to go with this next. So Angela, please.
Thank you, Chair. Just as a follow-on from the introduction that you've done, it was agreed that this statement would be produced and shared with this successor scrutiny board in terms of summarising the progress that's been made in relation to the inquiry, which includes a brief overview of preliminary findings that's stemming from the evidence to date, but also key considerations to help inform the next steps of the scrutiny board's work. So the statement of progress document, you can find that in the agenda pack on page 101, and members' attention is particularly drawn to section 5 of that statement, which aims to assist members in determining appropriate next steps for the scrutiny board's work. Section 5 is page 114, and particularly highlights sort of forthcoming national consultation responses, proposals in terms of forthcoming legislative changes. And I'm just mindful that we've touched upon a couple of those already in terms of the SEND Green Paper and the schools bill. So it's just that section is primarily for the board just to reflect on in terms of our next steps and for completing this piece of work. Thank you.
Thanks, Angela. Sal, please.
Very briefly, I'll let Shaheen and Val come in, but I guess part of your reflection there about how long this has been going on is also a reflection of the fact that these issues are live and changing all of the time. And so we're probably not going to get to a point where we kind of say that's it now. We've done with EHE, for example, and we don't ever have to look at it again. So I just think that we've just got to bear that in mind, I think. But also the other point that I would make is that we've talked a bit earlier on about whether, particularly elective home education, we report that, do we continue to report the data in over the coming municipal year, which we're happy to do, but there are other national measures being undertaken that we might want to consider as well. So I wonder whether it is best to consider what those areas from this inquiry we want to now take forward and in what shape as part of our look at what the work of the board is going to be for the coming year. We have we have had the inquiry into it. We have had consideration here. We've also had Ofsted in recently who've had a look at it, so it might be about a concentration on what the next national guidance looks like that we want to take forward.
Thank you. I think just adding to what Sal has outlined and what Councillor Lay mentioned earlier in terms of our knowledge of what actual legal powers do we have, what intervening powers do we have, and what regulation powers we have as well in terms of judging the quality of education that children receive, and also the increase in numbers, the rationale and the reasoning behind that. And it's worth noting, as Angela's pointed out in the report, that there's various legislation that is due out, and that legislation goes two ways. One is holding that register for those that are not in receipt of education, and we do hold some sort of register in terms of when we had our Ofsted inspection, but the register specifically for the EHE children. And the consultation response is really, really interesting in that the report, Children Not in Education, Not in School, outlines that parents do not want the local authority, and this is about 78% in terms of results, not to hold a register, but local authorities and schools would like a register to be held. So it's interesting to go into delve into detail about why, because then lots of questions will come off from that in terms of if we are to intervene, if we believe that a child is not receiving a good quality education, what are their current education plans? What other levers will there be in play in terms of our judgment and support? And also there's another element to the report which mentions that we as a local authority will have to support parents. That may inadvertently see a further rise in electively home educators, because the responsibility is on the parents to provide the education and for the local authority just to assess and judge whether the plan as we deem it to be effective or not. Other than that, there doesn't seem to be. But in terms of safeguarding procedures, of course there is eyes on children and knowing what we need to do as sort of next steps. So if, for example, the suggestions and the response to the children not in school move themselves through to send a green paper and then to the white paper, and holding the register which will come into play next year, we need to know and understand what will it mean for the local authority to support parents in their decision to selectively home educate their children. What powers and what criteria will be applied to the families who would then may see a demand in requirements to provide an education for children at home rather than the parents providing an education. So just open quite a lot of work and detail that we yet don't have within that. So going back to Sal's point, we can of course provide you with a regular update in terms of numbers. We can provide you with some elements to do with some trends. Are we seeing them concentrated in certain areas in certain schools? And I think Councillor Lamb, that was before I came into post. There was the initial start of scrutiny, which was an awful lot of data collated around regards to schools and clusters and wards, and if there's any spikes and trends in those areas. So there is an element here to revisit that. And I'm not going to steal Val's thunder because I think she wants to mention some important research that we would want to undertake into this area as well. So just wanted to just surmise that for you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's very much that there are so many unknowns. And I think, as Shaheen has just said, there are very different perspectives. So there is a very clear perspective coming from central government, which is about the safeguarding elements of those children that are being educated at home, and therefore proposals that sit around that. One of the biggest areas, though, is what constitutes suitable education, because there has not really been a definition as such. It's about age, aptitude, abilities, special educational needs, if any, and that is as far as the current definition goes. So the guidance at the moment is going to look at defining what is suitable, and therefore, alongside that, you would imagine it will also have progress measures, which has never been a duty of the local authority previously. So when a young person, a family decide they're going to be electively home educated, they have to submit the initial education plans, but there is no duty beyond that in terms of the local authority and the progress that that young person is making. So you can see that in some of the potential legislation that is going to come forward, there's going to be clarity around that area. The aspect that's around safeguarding clearly links into the other aspects that are around, if you see patterns, you know, that when we use the phrase electively home education, absolutely, there is a choice that some parents make quite clearly, quite deliberately. There are also those parents who do tell us that it wasn't necessarily a choice. It was because of the context for that young person, the particular school they were in, or the individual needs of that young person. So a piece of work that we are looking at with the university, with Trinity University, we've already started to do some work with Trinity that's around learners that may be in vulnerable contexts. And there's a whole host that you could describe, different groups, different cohorts of young people. So the piece of work we're already engaged in is a piece of national research where we are looking at the provision for all of those young people where we feel they're missing out from education and missing out from an education offer, and what could be put in place for those young people. So we are working with Denmark, with Sweden, Scotland is one of those as well. Leeds was chosen to represent the United Kingdom of what is good practice within that additional provision that can be put into place. So we are proposing further work with the university and with Trinity that will be about drilling down into those individual cohorts, but then looking and matching it across to particular schools within the local authority. So you'd identify all the schools and then you would cross-reference that and triangulate it in terms of those schools, how many young people are moving into elective home education and what is the reason, the rationale behind that? How many, alongside that, fixed term exclusions, suspensions, as they're now called, permanent exclusions, how many of those schools, the number of education, health and care plans. So you can see how you start then, you get a profile that was around individual schools, which leads you then into being able to raise questions, ask questions and work with those schools, to support them and to support the parents within it. So it's quite an exciting piece of research, just trying to get the University of Trinity to get hooked onto this next phase of it now.
Okay, thank you. I've got Councillor Forsyth first and then I'll bring you in, Councillor Bromley.
Right, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Val, for outlining the work that's being done in this. It does sound very exciting. However, just to come back, I have to say, when I read the report, my feeling was this is actually slipping away from the off-rolling issue, which in a sense was what we sort of looked at to start with. So I do think I'd like to know whether that still really needs to be looked at in the context of some of the things you just said, that there is a huge difference between parents of a child that might be in the autumn term of year 11 deciding to electively home educate and say an 8-year-old, a parents of an 8-year-old. So this isn't blanket. So but the work that you've just outlined, the research does sound very interesting, because there's obviously potentially quite a large cohort who at a younger age maybe electively home educate. So I'd like to, I'm concerned about the off-rolling issue slipping away from this, because if it's not looked at, that's what could happen to it. And also, I've also feel as a governor, as a chair of governors as well, I think the governors need to have much more training about the whole of the whole of this issue as well, really. I don't feel as the governor's service, I have to say, offers very good training indeed, but it's not necessarily, because it's not really a core area. So I feel that that could be looked at as well. Thank you.
Yep, thank you. Yep, Val.
Yeah, in terms of the off-rolling, absolutely correct. That was one of the main areas that we were looking at when we first started the inquiry. What became very clear was that off-rolling can appear in many guises. So it can be about an individual school moving children off their role into alternative provision or into other provisions. There's also a whole agenda that sits around there that we've just referred to, really, in elective home education, where it might not be a conscious choice of a family to go that route. That's a form of off-rolling as well. So the piece of work that I was talking about would encompass all the different possible aspects that you might say contribute to off-rolling. What during this inquiry, what also happened was Ofsted's real interest in off-rolling, and that was on the back of the Timpson review and the Timpson report. So that whole agenda then moved into Ofsted and into their criteria when they're going to school, and their judgment criteria and the things they specifically look at. And that now is a clear area. When they walk into a school, one of the first questions they ask is about young people that were on roll, that are no longer on roll, young people that have been put into alternative provision. And that directly affects the judgment now of a school. So that was a huge change that has occurred during this period over the last 3 years, really, since we started this inquiry, which we welcomed to look at, that Ofsted would also have that really clear view, because from a local authority's perspective, there are limited powers within the local authority, and it is Ofsted walking into a school. So all of the lobbying, all of the conversations that are around this, we felt, have been vindicated within Ofsted's now, their close focus on it.
Thank you for that. Councillor Bromley is next, please.
Thank you, Al. I just want to say I'm really excited about that news at Trinity University, and I look forward to supporting them and encouraging with them in any way I can, especially with it being in Horsworth Ward as well. I just wanted to touch on something that I think is sort of vaguely been mentioned, but in terms of the relationship between the council and people that choose to homeschool, there is a relationship breakdown, and I don't know that that's necessarily to do with the approach from the council as such, but that's happened, that breakdown has happened prior already during school at times where they feel that people in authority haven't taken their concerns and worries seriously, and the communication or the way that they were able to come to some sort of agreement wasn't tasteful for them. So therefore it's then reflected back into the council and authority, which then obviously they have to then sort of see how they can manage, which is really, really tricky. And I think isolation is a real concern. And obviously that becomes then children that are very in a level of being of concern, and like the lost children we were talking about. I think looking at Trinity University towards Denmark and Sweden, their focus on education is so much around well-being. So like they start their education later as well, so not quite 4 or 5 years old, at 7. And so everything is about what is child-centered, what suits a child, opposed to what would suit us as a country outcome that we would like as a result. And as a result, actually, of that, they then have better results long term. So I think us looking into countries that do put well-being at the centre of children's education would be absolutely paramount to looking for our education here. Thank you.
Those are really helpful points. I mean, I think one of the we brought here something called the 3A strategy that you may have seen about supporting learning, and in many ways it's not a strategy that's about the quality of teaching and learning once a child is at school. It's much more about the systems that sit around it, so that we see our responsibility as supporting children and young people's well-being, so that actually they can get to school, and once they get to school they're actually in a state in which they can learn. And so that is trying to do that piece about what's the responsibility of the rest of the children's services community. That means that when children get to school, they're in a fit state to learn, and then the quality of teaching and learning kicks in from the school's perspective. So I think I've heard about the Scandinavian approach in terms of the age that you described, because they do go to school, but they play, don't they, for the first few years rather than get engaged in more formal learning. But play is learning, so that's what they would say.
Okay, thank you for that. So I've got Councillor Bithell, and then Celia. And just if when people are commenting, just reflect, our recommendation is to think about what our next steps are with this inquiry. So yeah, that's where we need to go with this.
Thanks, Chair. What a lovely segue into me asking for a next step. I would like us to have a little look at any, maybe at the moment it would be anecdotal evidence around COVID and off-rolling and the impact of the changes to the way education has worked in the last couple of years, but also with, if the suggestion, I will be careful with my language, if the suggestion is that off-rolling happens because of difficulties with exam results, I wonder whether the impact of not having formal exams has impacted on the likelihood of schools to move to an off-rolling situation. And also, of course, if you're not in school accruing behaviour points, accruing the formal sanctions that then result in exclusion, if that has therefore had an impact on off-rolling as well. That would be really helpful for me. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Just to add to what Val was saying regarding off-rolling, just to provide some assurances in terms of Ofsted's duty and responsibility from a regulation point of view. That is a big piece of their work when they come in part of their framework. It's not as explicit, but it's within safeguarding. Now, parents can raise parent voice and parent view to Ofsted at any point if they feel that their child is being off-rolled or excluded for any other reason, apart from that child or that parent choosing not to be at that school. Those complaints are taken very, very seriously if it's deemed to be off-rolling or exclusion, because the Equality Act is there to prevent that from taking place. And I think what we want to do is look at the trends and the patterns for the choices that parents are making. If we deem that there is some sort of discrimination there, then we would need to then intervene alongside Ofsted and the Department for Education and work our way through what would be necessary to support the school and the parents and the child in reintegration, not necessarily at that school, but then what then would Ofsted and the DfE then put into place for a school where it was upheld that there was some sort of discrimination. So it's the trends and the patterns I think we need to identify. And as Val was pointing out rightly, it's where do you start? Because actually, some parents are not forthcoming with information about why they're choosing to do it. Some parents are doing it because they're in an attendance process order where they're receiving some fines, and for them it's far more convenient, but the powers are not given to the local authority to intervene at the right time and force the parents to return children back into education. And if there are some reasons to do with the school's not meeting the child's need in any way, shape or form, and the child is receiving an offer that is less than adequate, then what then do we put into place? What can we support the parents with? The parents are not necessarily forthcoming with information. So it's a triangulation of reason, rationale, and then working closely with the Department for Education, our Ofsted communication, and we have regular meetings with Ofsted on a bi-monthly basis where we bring up and they bring up to us where there may be concerns and spikes. We've noticed that. What's your information? And then we share that information toing and froing, and we also do the same as well. And actually, do you have any intel? And we use that then to triangulate and intervene. I would suggest that if we were to look at, for me, what aspects in terms of parents choosing to electively home educate their children is that the school is not meeting the need of that child. And it's establishing what we mean by meeting the need of that child and what evidence we have to prove that is taking place. That can be a magnitude of different things, boiled down to the Equality Act. And if we can, and there is elements there that we have got race discrimination, sex discrimination, or anything of the sort like that, that's when we will then need to take some serious learning back to the schools. So for us, if we were to look at it in terms of scrutiny and work schedule and to keep coming back to it, it is what then would we say next steps for schools if we find that that practice is in play, or potential systemic issues that are wider than just an isolation of a few schools. We would then recommend that any report of work that we would do would go to all the school sector.
Thank you. Firstly, thank you so much for that detailed response. That's really, really helpful. I guess the only bit that I still have concerns around is the idea that the parents have to bring it up. For me, that feels like it's a potential real hole in the system, in that if you're a family in crisis, the chances of you having the capacity with which to challenge the authority that for months or potentially years has been browbeating you because your child's not doing what the school is expecting of them, feels like it may be a bridge too far. And I totally understand the stuff you've just said about Ofsted will look at the trends and all that sort of stuff, and that's really great. But if Ofsted are coming in every 2 years, they may pick up the trend 18 months after this year 11's been kicked off and their education has therefore been affected. So I don't know exactly what I would suggest, but whether there's some sort of, or whether we already do it actually, there's some sort of check for every student that is, I know we don't have the legal right to do it, but whether there's something we can do as a sort of co-working arrangement.
I was just going to add very quickly, just in terms of Councillor Forsyth's earlier comment regarding governance. So in terms of another level of reassurance is that it should be a standing agenda item on each governing body meeting, exclusions, possible exclusions, pending exclusions. And that is where the level of detail there, which as on governing bodies, excuse me, you would look into and take apart. So if a parent feels that they're getting to that point where they have to make a decision such as that, then it will be the chair of governors that they would contact, but also the governing body minutes are available online and should be online. And if they're not online and you're not privy to that information, you can request that information as well to make sure that it is a standing agenda item and that governors have looked at that in detail and the challenge back. And then our involvement is the SMH panel, where the exclusions or potential exclusions and also support for children who may be needing alternative provision comes into play, where we then challenge back in terms of our inclusive offer and going back to the 3 A's, that actually we need to step in and support straight away if there is a result of that. But I think you make a really valid point. There's a gap where we're expecting parents to do that, and we need to look at how do we get that information to us. Going back to the Ofsted comment though, we had the monthly meetings would pick that up rather than 2-year waiting to. We would then give cause for concern to Ofsted if we saw a huge spike and a trend. And also as a team, we would intervene and visit the school and have those very robust conversations when we see our own internal understanding of what's happening in the city.
Yeah, just in addition about the things that we're already doing that is around that. So in terms of the elective home education, we ask that question so many times through that process. When a family do tell us that that is their choice, they're going to be electively home education, we ask the question, about the reason, the rationale that sits behind that, and try and support them through that process. Have a meeting with the family that is about what can we do to support you if actually what you would prefer is to go back into school. Some parents don't want that, some young people don't want that, but for those that say yes, there is a preference of going back into school, then we meet with those parents, we can meet with the school and we support them within that process. In relation to the actual identification of the trends as well, our area inclusion partnerships, our AIPs do an awful lot of that work that is around the identification. So 5 area inclusion partnerships in the city, partnership with the local authority, with the schools, and they have project managers, project leaders that are identifying where young people are being suspended from schools, where young people are moving out of the school system, so that they have got then a picture where we can, with the local authority, work in partnership to have those conversations with schools or with those individual parents. And as Shaheen said, the SEMH panel. So when you do get a young person that is in risk of permanent exclusion or have gone through a number of fixed term exclusions, the multi-agency panel that we've put together that is working with schools is very much asking those questions, solution focused working, where the multi-agency look at the indicators for that young person, the things that have gone wrong, the things that are working well, and how then we can put a package of support around the school, around the young person to ensure that they continue at that school. Or if indeed they need a new start, we will work them about a different school as well. So there are things already in place that we are working with.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay, I've got Celia and Councillor Forsyth, and then I'm going to wrap up this this section.
Thank you, Chair. Just recalling how our concern in this began, and we got papers, notes from a meeting held within a school of management, coming up with the wonderful idea of how to ensure exam results were high by offloading pupils, commonly known in the business as anchor students, who would pull down their results. Now, in a multi-academy trust, you can relocate those pupils to your own special provision. Is there any way that we can be aware of that? Because it would seem that high exam results matter greatly to certain multi-academy trusts. They matter to all schools, but there seems to be more of an ambition to remain top in the scoring system. And it concerns me that that can still go on. Ofsted, as Councillor Biddle said, do not go into schools constantly. It's every 2, 3, or recently even more years. And whilst they may pick up trends across a range of schools, certain schools can get away with their own internal arrangements for some time. And it was only by chance, well, it wasn't, it was contrived, it wasn't by chance, that we were made aware of this. And it can still be going on without, how can that be addressed?
Hold that thought for a minute, because we're in danger of reopening the inquiry right now, and we're looking at all good comments. So I'll just take the last few people, and then we can look at what the proposed way forward is, because I think there's no doubt this is still very much of interest to the board. So Councillor Forsyth, please.
This is actually a very specific question that which I possibly ought to know the answer to, but I actually don't know that much about academies. And it builds on, well, it doesn't build on, it's part of your point. Thank you very much for outlining about the fact that exclusion should be part of governing body agendas, and also about publishing them. The question is, does that apply to academies as well? I don't know the answer to that. Perhaps I should do.
If it's a quick answer, then go for it now. Yeah. Okay. I like that kind of answer. Councillor Lay, quick point.
Thanks, Chair. This is hopefully the final and very simple question, a bit like yours, very specific. So going back to first principles, are we sure as an authority we know where every child is in this city? It's a quite simple question, isn't it? Even if they're not in education.
Sorry, Councillor, do you mean, do we know where every child is in the city? So all of those.
Yeah, where they live, and are there hidden children who might be at risk of safeguarding or deprivation or falling behind? Are we? Well, that's the first principle then. Surely we need to find out where they all are.
So there are systems that actually sit around that, but I think some of the legislation, as we've just referred to now, sort of counters some of that. So for instance, if a child goes into school at reception, we know where that young child is. If they leave school, we know where they are. We then have systems in place because they have a right to education, so that we know where they are. Electively home educated can pick them up. But the system as it stands, if a child comes into the city and they haven't registered, if they're a very, very young child, if they've never been to school, again, there is no duty currently for them to register with a school or elective home education. So I think that is why some of the legislation now, as we're moving through it, is to tighten up on all of those safeguarding aspects that give the local authority powers and duties to identify all of those young people, where they are, whether attending school. And school is one of the main factors within that safeguarding picture, because you know that the child should be attending school. If they're not attending school, then it alerts so many different agencies to get involved. But it's those children that have never been to school or that are new into the city, and that's where some of the legislation is being tightened up around it.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Bithell, you get the last word.
Excellent. That was terrifying when you said, oh, it's the end of the debate, and I tried not to just make a giant list. Anyway, I'll come back to my lists. Number 4.31 talks about going to the equality and diversity meeting. Moving forward, can we have sight of the discussion or the minutes from that, please? I found reading this really frustrating because there was so much in it that was actually, this is what we'd like, or this is what we can see is happening, this is what we'd like to do. But there's so many bits of it that we don't have any authority over as a local authority. And I just think it's worth absolutely saying that aloud, that level of frustration that I'm feeling for the purposes of the minutes. And then the other bit I thought was very interesting and something I'd quite like us to take up is on 4.14, it talks about the young people and the focus group discussion, and the fact that there's discussion is that tackling behaviour issues as a school is really important. And I just wonder if we could have a look at whether any schools, I mean, I'm sure there's a bunch of teachers on here. I'm sure we've all had that CPD training where you look at therapeutic behaviour management. And I'd like to know whether or not there is the same responses from students in schools that practice really effective restorative practice and really effective therapeutic behaviour management to those that don't. Because actually, if all we ever show young people is a sort of punitive sanction-based behaviour management system, actually they will say that's what they want, because good behaviour in their mind comes from those that are a problem being removed, etc. That's how they see their lessons are going better and how they're doing more learning. But I wonder whether it's because we don't actually show them effectively another way. So I don't know if that's something we could aim to look at if we have that information on which schools do that particularly well.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Bithell. Okay, right. Well, I'm kind of going to stray into item 12 as well with a proposed way forward. So we've covered, there's no question that this is something that's still of massive interest to the board and that we want to keep working on. I think what we need to do is put that in the same context of all the other things we've put forward this morning. And so what I'd like to propose is that myself and Angela and Sal get together, look at all of these issues and a practical way of covering as many of them as possible. But what those of us that have been doing scrutiny a long time also know is if we try and do too much, we end up doing a lot badly. And it's often better to do a small amount and do it really well and have a big impact. So I think it's looking at where there are cross-cutting themes from the things that we've looked at this morning, and how we can put those into a sensible number of inquiries that we can do as a board, that the officers can facilitate, and that we're also looking at something I'm keen on this year is that we look to bring in more people from outside the council, so users, professionals, other organisations, to get their perspective, and I think that will add a lot of value to our deliberations. But it's about just being focused. So if everyone's agreeable, that's I think how I'd suggest we go forward. That myself, Andrew, and Sal have a bit of a brainstorming session to see what we think looks like a sensible programme for the year, and come back to the board. We can't cover absolutely everything that's been suggested, because if we try and do that, as I say, we'll still do a lot of work, but what impact will we have at the end of it? And that's really what this is all about. So is everyone agreeable with that approach? Sal, is there anything you'd like to?
No, I think that's a really sensible way forward. I think there are, one of the things I was saying to the team before we came in was if we might want to start thinking in terms of themes for meetings. So if you've got learning type issues, then we can have a concentration of people from the learning part of the directorate, but also, as you say, external people from learning. If you've got a social care theme one week, then we can concentrate the team's activity on 1 month. We can concentrate the team's activity on that. So I think from all the suggestions that we've had, we can probably bunch a number of them together if possible. But I think your point about impact is right. I think if we try and cover all of it, then there's likely to be less impact, whereas actually picking off a small number of high priority issues will help us with that, I think.
Mr. Renshaw.
Can I just ask, following on from Councillor Bithell's comments, could we have reassurance that all the schools within our city are delivering restorative practice? Because there was a time when that was the case, and I don't know if all the academies are now still taking on the restorative practice that was sort of citywide delivered.
It's a difficult question to answer in the sense that what one person's understanding of restorative practice and another's is can differ quite greatly, and so there will be some people who describe something as restorative that other people think isn't. So it's not a requirement for people to take that approach, and we work to restorative practice principles within children's services and encourage people to work along the same lines, given the success that we've kind of had with it over the years. But it's not in our gift to say schools should or shouldn't take up that as an approach.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so we've kind of strayed into the work schedule. The other area that we need to be conscious of is that we've got a commitment from the Leeds Safeguarding Children's Partnership Executive to come back to us to share the report on the outcome of notifications review. So once we know where that is, then we'll fit that into the work schedule as well. So I think we've agreed a way forward. There's no doubt we're going to have a busy year, I think, but I'm really looking forward to working with all of you this year. And it's about having the best impact that we can. What I'm always absolutely convinced about is everybody around this table is totally committed to doing the best possible for children and families in our city. And that's what our work will be focused on for the year. So thank you all very much. The final item is the date and time of the next meeting, which is Wednesday, the 6th of July at 10 a.m, pre-meeting usual time, 9:45. I look forward to seeing you all then. Thank you very much.